See, she didn't knock. She didn't wait. She just walked straight into his general store like she owned the air inside it, planted both hands on the counter, and looked Gideon Mercer dead in the eye with a smile that didn't reach hers. See, I heard you've been sniffing around Clara Bellamy, Margaret Holt said, loud enough for every customer in the store to hear. See, let me save you the embarrassment, rancher. A woman like Clara doesn't end up on a dirt farm with a man who smells like cattle and talks to fence posts. She laughed a bright cutting sound and several heads turned. See, she's meant for better. Everyone in Redwillow knows it. See, even you know it. So do yourself a favor and stay on your side of the valley. See, Gideon stood there, holding a sack of feed like it was the only steady thing in the room. See, he didn't say a word. He never did. And Margaret Holt walked out the door, knowing she'd hit something real. See, that moment cracked something open in him that 12 years of hard work had almost sealed shut the part of him that still wanted to believe he deserved more than an empty table and a cold stove. See, if you've ever been told you weren't enough for someone, stay with me. See, because this story is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. See, before we go further, if this is your first time here, please take a moment and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. See, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. See, I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Redwillow, Montana, 1886, and the man who had almost given up on being chosen. See, Gideon Mercer had not always been a man who expected nothing. See, there was a time he was maybe 22, 23 when he'd ride into whatever small settlement existed before Redwillow was even properly named, and he'd feel something close to hunger. See, not for food, for a life that looked like the ones other men seemed to fall into without trying. See, a woman at the table, a lamp burning in the window when he came in from the dark. See, boots by the door that weren't his. He'd wanted that. See, badly enough that it embarrassed him now to remember. See, but wanting something badly and deserving it turned out to be two entirely different territories, and no amount of hard work mapped you from one to the other. See, he'd tried twice. 2 women, 2 courtships that he'd conducted with all the grace of a man trying to shoe a horse he'd never met. See, the first was a girl named Dora Shields. See, who had come west from Ohio with her family and seemed to genuinely like him for about 4 months before she realized that liking a man and wanting to live 12 miles from the nearest neighbor were not the same decision. See, she married a feed merchant in town. He went to the wedding because people would have talked if he didn't, stood in the back, and rode home before the dancing started. See, the second was worse because he'd been older and should have known better. See, her name was Ruth Compton, and she'd actually agreed to come out to the ranch twice, which Gideon had taken as evidence that she was different. See, she wasn't different. She was polite. There's a gap between those two things wide enough to lose a whole future in, and Gideon had fallen straight into it. See, after Ruth, he stopped expecting, not dramatically. See, not with bitterness, just quietly, the way a man stops checking for rain when he's been through enough dry summers. See, you don't decide to stop hoping. You just notice one morning that you haven't looked at the sky in a while. See, that was where Gideon Mercer was when Clara Bellamy first came into his life, which is to say, nowhere in particular. See, just a man doing his work, keeping his accounts square, treating his animals decently, and not asking the world for anything it wasn't already giving him. See, he went into Redwillow every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on what the ranch needed. See, it wasn't a trip he dreaded or enjoyed, especially it was a function, like fixing a gate or cleaning a water trough. See, you went because the alternative was running short of things you couldn't grow or make yourself. See, he'd been trading at Bellamy's general store for years before he actually noticed Clara in any particular way. See, she'd been there the whole time. Of course, old Gerald Bellamy's daughter, keeping the ledgers, handling the accounts, occasionally helping customers when her father's knees were bothering him. See, but Gideon had always been the kind of man who looked at a store and saw inventory, not the people managing it. See, something he was not proud of in retrospect. See, The first time he actually saw her not as a fixture, but as a person with a specific kind of intelligence behind her eyes was an ordinary Tuesday in late spring, the kind of day that doesn't warn you it's going to matter. See, he'd brought in a supply list written on the back of an old receipt, and he'd made an error somewhere in his calculations. See, he knew there was an error because the numbers didn't match what he'd expected to pay, but he couldn't find it on his own. He'd been staring at the same column of figures for 10 minutes, and the mistake kept hiding from him. See, Clara reached across the counter, took the paper without asking permission, glanced at it for about 4 seconds, and pointed to the third line. See, you wrote 20 pounds of salt, but you meant 2, she said. See, the 2 and the 0 are close in your handwriting. See, easy to miss. He looked at the paper. She was right. See, immediately and completely right. How'd you see that fast? He asked, because he genuinely wanted to know. See, she shrugged, but not dismissively. It was the shrug of someone who'd long since stopped thinking of their own abilities as unusual. See, numbers don't hide well if you know where to look. See, the column was too high by 18. Once you know the error amount, you just find what caused it. See, she handed the paper back, already turning toward the shelf behind her to pull his salt. See, he stood there for a moment with the corrected list in his hand, feeling something he hadn't felt in a while. See, not attraction exactly, or not only that, something more like recognition. See, the feeling you get when you realize the person standing in front of you is actually paying attention to the world, not just passing through it. See, he paid for his supplies and left. He didn't make anything of it. See, but he remembered it. That was the thing. 3 weeks later, when he made the drive back into Redwillow, he remembered the conversation. See, and when he walked into Bellamy's, he found himself noticing whether she was at the counter. See, she was. She looked up. She said, "Mercer, the way you greet someone you recognize but don't particularly need anything from." See, he said, "Miss Bellamy," and that was the whole exchange. See, but he noticed it on the ride home, the fact that she'd used his name without looking at a ledger first. See, the months turned the way Montana months do slowly in winter, fast in summer, with no interest in what you needed from them. See, Gideon kept going to Redwillow. He kept going to Bellamy's. See, the conversations got slightly longer each time, the way water slowly widens a channel not through any single dramatic effort, just through persistence. See, she asked him once how many head he was running, and when he told her, she asked a follow-up question that surprised him, not how much that was worth, the way most town people asked. See, but whether the pasture on his land could support more, or whether he was already near the limit. See, that was a rancher's question, a thoughtful one, from a woman who'd never worked a ranch in her life. See, he told her the truth that he was probably about at the limit for water access, and he'd been thinking about whether it was worth trying to negotiate access to the creek on the Harlan property to the north. See, she'd nodded seriously, like the problem was genuinely worth considering. See, that was when Margaret Holt had walked into the store. See, Margaret Holt was the wife of a man who'd made money in territorial land speculation and spent it on making sure everyone in Redwillow understood exactly how much money he'd made. See, she wasn't an evil woman in any dramatic sense. She was simply a person who'd organized her entire self-image around a hierarchy that she needed to remain fixed. See, and Clara Bellamy occupying some comfortable friendship with a cattle rancher from the edge of the valley did not fit that hierarchy. See, so she'd done what she did. She'd said what she'd said, loud enough for the room to hear, and she'd walked out with the satisfaction of a woman who believes she's done someone a service by telling them their place. See, the store went quiet, not dramatically, just the way a room goes quiet when something uncomfortable has landed and nobody knows whether to acknowledge it. See, Gideon set the feed sack on the counter carefully. See, Clara was looking at him, not with embarrassment, not with pity. See, with something he couldn't quite name, like she was waiting to see what he'd do with the words that had just been thrown at him. See, he could have said something sharp. He thought of 3 things in about 2 seconds, any one of which would have satisfied the room. See, instead, he picked up his list and continued going through it. See, I also need 2 spools of wire, he said. Barbed. See, 16 gauge if you have it. Clara held his gaze for one more second. See, then she turned around and started pulling wire from the shelf behind her. See, he didn't know until much later that that was the moment she decided something about him. See, he just knew that he drove home that day, feeling heavier than the wagon load he was carrying, because Margaret Holt had said out loud what he'd been telling himself for years. See, and hearing it from someone else's mouth made it feel less like caution and more like a verdict. See, 2 weeks passed. Then 3. He went back to Redwillow for supplies, and Clara was at the counter, and they talked the way they always talked, practical, specific, neither of them reaching for anything beyond the transaction. See, and then, on a Wednesday afternoon in early July, with the heat sitting heavy over the valley and the road throwing up pale dust behind every passing wagon, see, Gideon was checking the east fence line when he heard hoofbeats on the trail that cut along the edge of his property. See, he looked up. Clara Bellamy was riding along that trail on a brown mare he recognized from the livery stable in town. See, she was not going anywhere in particular, or if she was, she'd taken a route that swung considerably further from the direct path than it needed to. See, she stopped when she saw him. He stopped when he saw her. See, they looked at each other across 20 feet of summer-dried grass for a moment that stretched longer than it had any right to. See, Miss Bellamy, he said. I was riding the valley road, she said, which was technically true in the way that all the most complicated things are technically true. See, thought I'd see how the land looked from this side. See, he didn't question it. He would wonder later why he hadn't. But in the moment, the explanation seemed to arrive exactly in the space where a question might have been. See, he walked his horse over to the fence line, and they talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. The drought that kept threatening and not arriving, the elk he'd been seeing near the north pasture. See, whether Gerald Bellamy's knee was going to need a real doctor or would sort itself out the way his knee always had in the past. See, she rode on. He went back to his fence, but that night, eating supper alone the way he ate every supper, he found himself thinking about the conversation. See, not about anything she'd said specifically, just the fact of it, a person, in the middle of a day, riding slightly out of her way to talk to him for 20 minutes about nothing that mattered. See, he told himself it was neighborliness. He was a grown man. See, he knew it wasn't just neighborliness, but fear has its own vocabulary, and one of its most useful words is probably. See, probably she was just being kind. Probably it meant nothing beyond politeness. See, probably he was doing what he always did, which was seeing something that wasn't there because he wanted it to be there. See, so he applied probably to the whole afternoon and put it away. See, she came back the following week. See, this time she didn't pretend she happened to be passing. See, she rode straight up the trail to where he was working near the barn and dismounted without being invited, which startled him enough that he nearly dropped the tool he was holding. See, I want to understand how this works, she said, looking at the hitch he was repairing with an expression of genuine curiosity rather than polite interest. See, the ranch, all of it, I know how a ledger works. I know how inventory turns over. See, I don't know how the actual land runs. He stared at her for a second. See, why, he said. It wasn't a rude question, it was the only honest one. See, she met his eyes without flinching, because I think it matters to understand the things that matter to people. See, and ranching matters to you. He couldn't find an argument against that. See, so he showed her. See, not everything, there wasn't enough afternoon for everything, but he walked her through the barn, explained the basic logic of the herd rotation, showed her the water situation, and why the creek access question was more urgent than it looked. See, she asked real questions, not polite ones, not the kind designed to seem interested, actual questions that showed she'd been listening to the previous answer before she asked the next one. See, when she finally got back on her horse to ride home, the light was going amber and long across the pasture. See, same time next week? She asked, completely matter-of-factly, like they'd agreed to something and she was just confirming the schedule. See, he meant to say something cautious, something responsible. See, if you want. he said instead. She rode away. He stood in the same spot for longer than he should have, watching the trail where her horse had gone, and he felt it then, the thing he'd been working so hard to keep down. See, not hope exactly. Something rawer than hope. Something that didn't have a clean name yet, but that sat in his chest like an ember he couldn't quite bring himself to smother. See, he went inside. He made himself up supper. He sat at the table that had one chair and one plate and one cup, and he told himself very firmly that whatever this was, it was going to end the same way everything ended. See, he told himself that. He didn't believe it anymore. See, and that scared him more than anything Margaret Holt had ever said in a crowded store. See, because fear you can name is manageable. It's the hope you can't control that'll wreck you. See, and Gideon Mercer, who had survived drought and loneliness and 2 broken courtships, and 12 hard years of a frontier life that asked everything and gave back exactly what you put in Gideon, Mercer was starting to hope again. See, which meant, of course, that he was starting to have something real to lose. See, she came back the following Wednesday, same as she'd said she would. See, Gideon had told himself he wasn't going to watch the trail. See, he'd told himself that 3 times before noon, which meant he was watching the trail by 10 o'clock and had been checking it every 20 minutes since. See, he was aware of how ridiculous that was. He did it anyway, because self-awareness and self-control turn out to be entirely different muscles, and one of his was considerably stronger than the other. See, Clara rode up at 2:30 in the afternoon. See, dismounted at the fence post, the same way she had the week before, like it was a thing she'd been doing for years, and walked toward him with the same direct, unhurried way she had of moving through space. See, she wasn't a woman who announced herself before she arrived. See, she just arrived. "I've been thinking about the creek situation," she said, before she'd even reached him properly. See, the Harlan property. "You said the creek runs along the northern boundary?" See, he blinked. "Good afternoon to you too, Miss Bellamy." See, she had the grace to look briefly amused. "Good afternoon, Gideon." See, now the creek. Does it run along the boundary, or does the boundary cut across it? See, he'd spent 12 years talking to ranch hands, livestock buyers, and the occasional government surveyor. See, none of them had opened a conversation by cutting straight to a problem he'd been quietly chewing on for 6 months. See, he didn't know whether to be impressed or unsettled, so he was both. See, along it, he said, the Harlan line follows the eastern bank for about half a mile before it turns north. See, if I had access to that stretch during dry season, I could rotate the herd out to the north pasture without hauling water. See, and you've spoken to Harlan? Once. He wasn't interested. See, she nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was calculating something behind her eyes. See, was he not interested because he needed the creek access himself, or not interested because he didn't want to deal with the conversation? See, Gideon thought about it honestly. Second one, probably. See, he's not running many cattle anymore. His son left 2 years ago, and he's managing alone. See, then the conversation wasn't done, Clara said. You just stopped having it. See, he opened his mouth, closed it, because she was right, and the infuriating thing was she'd seen it in about 30 seconds from information he'd been sitting with for half a year. See, you want to walk the north fence, he said, which was his version of acknowledging she had a point without saying so directly. See, that's why I came, she said. So they walked it, the whole north line, nearly a mile of it, with the afternoon heat pressing down and the grass dry enough to crunch underfoot. See, Gideon talked about the pasture rotation, the capacity problem, the way a bad summer could turn a manageable situation into a crisis inside of 6 weeks. See, Clara listened without filling the silences with anything unnecessary, which was rarer than it should have been, and which Gideon found himself appreciating more than he knew how to say. See, at the corner post where the north fence met the east line, they could see the Harlan property beginning a stretch of land that looked harder used than his own, the fencing older, some of it sagging where posts had started to lean. See, beyond it, invisible from here but there if you knew the land, the creek ran its quiet course along the eastern edge. See, he's struggling, Clara said, looking at the Harlan fence line with the same practical assessment she applied to everything. See, that's not the fence of a man who's given up. That's the fence of a man who doesn't have enough hours in the day anymore. See, no, Gideon agreed. So maybe the conversation isn't about what you want from his creek. See, maybe it's about what you could both get from an arrangement that helps him too. She turned to look at him. See, what does Harlan need that you have? Gideon thought about it. See, labor, probably. His south pasture butts up against my winter grazing land. See, if we had a shared access arrangement, I could run fence repairs along the mutual boundary as part of the deal. See, save him weeks of work. Clara looked at him for a moment with an expression he was starting to recognize, not quite surprise, but something close to satisfaction. See, like she'd asked a question she already half knew the answer to, and he'd confirmed the half she wasn't sure about. See, you knew that already, she said. I knew it, he admitted. See, I just hadn't put it together that way. Why not? See, he didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. See, the truth was that he'd been thinking about the creek situation as a negotiation, something he needed to win rather than as a problem two struggling men might solve together. See, that was a particular kind of blindness that came from spending too much time alone with your own thoughts. See, your thinking calcifies. You stop seeing angles because nobody's standing at a different angle from you. See, Clara was standing at a different angle, and she wasn't even trying to be useful. See, she just naturally looked at things from somewhere he didn't. See, they walked back toward the barn without hurrying. See, the conversation drifted the way conversations drift when two people are comfortable enough with each other to let them from the creek to the way water rights worked in the territory. See, to the general mess of land law that followed settlement west like a shadow, to a story Clara told about a boundary dispute that had come through her father's store accounts 3 years back. See, two families nearly coming to blows over 12 feet of surveyed line that turned out to have been measured wrong in the original deed. See, she told it well, dry, specific, with a wry eye for the absurdity of men destroying good relationships over things that could be solved with a measuring tape and a civil conversation. See, Gideon laughed a real one, not the polite kind, and then felt briefly self-conscious about it, which was its own kind of ridiculous thing to feel. See, at the barn, Clara's mare was still tied where she'd left her, patient as only a horse that's used to waiting can be. See, Clara untied her but didn't mount immediately. She stood with the reins loose in her hand, looking at the barn the way she sometimes looked at the fence lines, taking in information without judgment, just filing it. See, this is a good place, she said. It wasn't a compliment designed to make him feel better. See, it was an observation. It's a hard place, he said. See, those aren't opposites. See, she mounted and rode, and he watched her go the way he'd been watching her go for weeks now, and the ember that had taken up residence in his chest was burning a little hotter and a little less comfortably than it had been before. See, the visits continued through July and into August. See, she came roughly once a week, sometimes twice if something specific had come up that she wanted to talk through a question about herd management she'd been turning over. See, something she'd read in a farming almanac her father stocked that she wasn't sure applied to cattle country the same way it applied to grain farming further east. See, she brought things to the conversations, not gifts information, observations, questions that showed she'd been thinking about his situation even when she wasn't there. See, that was the thing that got to him most, not the visits themselves, but the evidence they carried that she was thinking about his land, his herd, his problems, in the days between. See, it wasn't the behavior of someone passing time. It was the behavior of someone who had decided that something mattered. See, he kept waiting for the thing that would explain it in a way that didn't mean what it seemed to mean. See, a practical reason, a hidden angle, something that would let him file it under neighborliness or charity or simple curiosity without having to deal with the alternative. See, the alternative being that Clara Bellamy, who was admired by every eligible man in Redwillow and could have had a comfortable life without ever seeing the outside of town. See, was choosing to spend her Wednesday afternoons and sometimes her Saturday mornings walking fence lines with him. See, he could not find the alternative explanation. He looked hard. See, it wasn't there, which left him with a problem he had no tools for. See, it was a Saturday in late August when Margaret Holt made her second appearance in the story of Gideon Mercer's life, and this time she didn't bother with the crowd. See, Gideon had come into Redwillow for supplies. He still needed supplies. The ranch still required things he couldn't make himself, and he'd be damned if he let Margaret Holt's opinion change his trading habits. See, he'd tied his horse in front of Bellamy's and was walking up the steps when the woman herself appeared from the side of the building as if she'd been waiting. See, maybe she had been waiting. Mercer, she said. Just the name, flat and deliberate. See, he stopped on the second step, Mrs. Holt. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who believes they are doing you a kindness by being brutal. See, I'm going to say this plainly because I think you're a plain man. See, Clara Bellamy's father has had 3 conversations in the past month with Edward Graves about a possible arrangement. See, Graves has the dry goods operation over in Millhaven. See, solid man. Good prospects, her father is sensible. See, Gideon held very still. I'm only telling you, Margaret continued, because you seem like a decent enough man who's about to make a fool of himself, and I'd rather prevent that than watch it happen. See, he looked at her for a long moment. Did Clara ask you to tell me this? See, a flicker of something crossed her face. Not quite guilt. See, more like the irritation of someone whose authority has been questioned by the wrong person. See, Clara doesn't know I'm telling you, but a woman in her position listens to her father. See, and her father is practical, is he? Gideon said. See, it wasn't a question. It was the tone a man uses when he's deciding how much of what he's thinking to let out into the open, and he decided on almost none of it. See, he walked past her and into the store. Clara was at the counter. See, she looked up when he came in, and her face did the thing it had been doing lately, a small, specific shift, like a window opening a quarter inch. See, not dramatic. Just the shift of someone who's genuinely glad to see a particular person walk through a door. See, you look like you just ate something bad, she said. See, I ran into Mrs. Holt outside. Clara's expression went carefully neutral in the way of someone who has had practice managing their reaction to a specific name. See, what did she want? He looked at her directly. He was not a man who was good at indirection when a thing mattered, and this mattered. See, she told me your father's been talking to a man named Graves in Millhaven. See, the neutrality held for a second. Then Clara set down the pen she'd been holding and looked at him with something that was not quite exasperation and not quite something warmer. See, my father talks to a lot of people, she said. He talked to 3 land agents last month and 2 of them wanted to buy the building. See, he's not selling the building. This is a different kind of conversation, apparently. See, is it? She held his gaze. If it were, would that be something you needed to know, Gideon? For what reason exactly? See, he felt the ground shift under him the way it did in the moment before something structural gave way. See, the question wasn't cruel. It was honest, and honest questions aimed at the right target are the most dangerous kind. See, he didn't have an answer he was prepared to give. Not a true one. See, the true one lived behind a door he hadn't opened yet because he was afraid of what was on the other side, and Clara was standing in front of that door asking him what his intentions were with language she wasn't quite using. See, I don't know, he said, which was the most honest thing he could have said and also the worst possible answer. See, Clara nodded once, very slightly, like something had been confirmed. See, what do you need today, she asked, and the conversation closed like a hand around a held breath. See, he gave her his list. She filled it. They talked in the practical, transactional way they'd talked before all of this had started, and it was awful, not because she was cold, but because she was exactly the same as always. See, and he now understood that the space between who she was and what he wanted to say to her was a space he'd created himself and was the only person who could close it. See, he drove home with a full wagon and an emptier feeling than he'd had in months. See, she still came the following Wednesday. See, he hadn't been sure she would. He'd spent 3 days turning the store conversation over in his head, certain he'd broken something, equally uncertain what the right move would have been instead. See, there wasn't one. See, he'd told her the truth. See, which was that he didn't know. See, which was true but incomplete. See, which was the worst kind of incomplete. See, but she came. Brown mare on the trail, same dismount at the fence post, same direct walk toward where he was working. See, he felt the relief of seeing her so physically that it frightened him. See, Gideon, she said. Miss Bellamy. She stopped a few feet from him and looked at him with her head slightly tilted, the way she looked at a column of numbers she was deciding how to interpret. See, can I ask you something directly? You always do, he said. See, the smallest edge of a smile. Do you enjoy these visits? See, he was quiet for a moment. Not because the answer was complicated, but because the true answer was large, and he wasn't sure how much of it he could say without saying all of it. See, yes, he said. More than I should probably admit. See, why more than you should admit? Because admitting it implies something. See, what does it imply? He looked at her. The afternoon sun was behind her, and she was looking back at him with the same steady attention she gave to everything, and he thought, this woman is not nervous. See, she is not fishing for something uncertain. She already knows what she thinks, and she is waiting to see if he has the courage to catch up. See, that recognition did not make it easier, it made it harder. See, it implies, he said slowly, that I've been looking forward to Wednesdays. See, have you? Yes, she looked at him for a long moment. See, that's not very frightening, Gideon. The part that frightens me is what comes after Wednesdays, he said, and immediately felt exposed in a way he hadn't felt since he was young and stupid enough to think exposure was safe. See, Clara was quiet. She was looking at him the way you look at something real, not to evaluate it, but to understand it. See, I'm not fragile, she said. I want you to know that. See, whatever you're trying to protect me from, I know you're not fragile. See, then what are you protecting? He didn't answer, because the answer was himself. See, he was protecting himself. See, he was standing 4 feet from a woman who had ridden out to his fence line again and again, who had asked his questions for him before he could ask them, who had looked at his hard life and called it a good place, and he was protecting himself. See, with what? With the ghost of 2 failed courtships. See, with Margaret Holt's flat voice, with 12 years of being perfectly, completely alone. See, he was using caution as armor, and he was running out of ways not to know it. See, I'll get better at answering that, he said. It was the best he could offer. See, she studied him a moment longer. Then I can wait for better answers. See, I'm patient with things that are worth being patient about. See, she said it simply, the way she said everything simple and complicated at once. See, and then she walked with him to the pasture fence, and they talked about the cattle rotation, and everything was the same as it always was, except that something underneath had shifted about 3 degrees, and they both knew it. See, September came in hot, and stayed hot 2 weeks longer than it should have. See, the ranch demanded everything from him that month. A section of east fence came down after a storm that wasn't supposed to amount to anything but did. See, 2 calves got into difficulty during a minor illness that moved through the herd faster than he could get ahead of it, and the hay situation was bad enough that he had to make a supply decision he'd been hoping to postpone until spring. See, Clara still came on Wednesdays. She helped without being asked. See, not with the hard labor that wasn't the offer she was making, but with the thinking. See, she sat with him at the rough table in the barn, where he spread his accounts, and she went through his numbers with the same sharp eye she turned on everything. See, finding places where he was overspending on credit and underspending on things that would cost more later. See, you've got a good ranch, she told him, one evening when the sun was already low, and she'd stayed longer than usual without either of them commenting on it. See, you're just managing it like a man who thinks it might not survive. See, he looked at her. You keep your spending low because you're always prepared for failure, she said. See, not unkindly. Specifically, that's good practice up to a point. See, past that point, it just means you're not investing in the things that would make failure less likely. See, when you run everything alone, he said, Failure is always an option you have to keep room for. See, she looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read. See, what if you didn't run everything alone? The question dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. See, the ripples went in all directions. He knew what she was saying. See, he knew it clearly enough that his chest tightened with the weight of it. See, and he did what he'd been doing. Since the very first Wednesday she'd ridden up his trail, he found the door that led to the real answer and stood in front of it without going through. See, Clara, he said. Gideon, she said back, in the exact same tone, which somehow made it worse and better at the same time. See, a woman who's accustomed to living in town, he started. See, don't, she said. He stopped. Don't tell me what a woman accustomed to town would or wouldn't want, she said. See, I've been coming out here for 2 months. I know what this land looks like in heat, and what it smells like in a storm, and what it costs you in hours and in body to run it. See, I've seen your fence lines and your water situation and your account ledgers. See, I am not a woman who doesn't know what she's looking at. See, I know that, he said. Then why do you keep explaining the ranch to me like I'm someone who wandered in by accident? See, he had no answer to that. See, or he had one, and it was the same one he'd been carrying since the conversation in the store, and he still couldn't get it out of his chest and into words without feeling like he was stepping off a ledge he couldn't see the bottom of. See, I just don't want you to decide you want something, he said, and then realize the reality of it is harder than you thought. See, that's remarkably similar to not trusting my judgment, Clara said. See, the words hit him with a precision he wasn't prepared for, because they were accurate, and accuracy at close range is always harder than a clean miss. See, it's not that I don't trust your judgment, he said. See, then what is it? He was quiet. The thing about silence with Clara was that she didn't fill it for you. See, she let it sit there and do its work, which meant the silence kept doing its work until he had to say something or simply give up. See, I've been here 12 years, he said finally. Alone. See, and I've gotten very good at surviving it. And I don't, he stopped. See, started again. I don't know how to want something I can't work for. See, you can work for a fence. You can work for water. You work hard enough and long enough, and the fence gets fixed and the water comes. See, this isn't that kind of problem. He hadn't meant to say that much. See, it came out because the silence had pulled it out of him, and now it was in the open air between them, and he couldn't pull it back. See, Clara looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face had changed, not softened exactly, but opened. See, like a window after a long closed room. No, she said quietly. See, it's not that kind of problem. She didn't say anything else immediately, and neither did he, and the last of the day's light pulled long across the dry grass, and the barn threw its shadow east, and the mare at the post was patient as ever. See, same time Wednesday, Clara said eventually. Yes, he said. See, she rode away. He stood in the same spot and breathed the late summer air and understood two things simultaneously, that he was in love with Clara Bellamy in a way that was now completely past the point of pretending otherwise. See, and that he was going to find a reason to ruin it before it became real enough to lose. See, that second thing frightened him more than anything he'd felt in years. See, not because it was a new feeling, because it was an old one. See, the oldest one he had. The one he'd been carrying so long it had started to feel like part of his personality rather than something he could put down. He went inside. He ate supper. The table had one chair and one plate and one cup, same as always. See, it had never felt like as much of a choice as it did that night. See, he went to see Harlan the following week. See, he didn't plan it as a distraction. It wasn't. See, the creek situation was real. And Clara had been right that the conversation wasn't finished, and he'd been putting it off long enough that the practical part of his brain had finally overruled the avoidant. See, Harlan was a weathered man in his late 60s who received Gideon at his door with the wariness of someone who'd had enough conversations go badly that he'd stopped assuming new ones would go well. See, he stood in the doorway of a house that was clean but thin, the kind of clean that's maintained by habit and not by comfort. See, Gideon laid it out the way Clara had helped him see it. See, Not as a negotiation, but as a problem two men might both benefit from solving. C. Creek access for water rotation on his end, fence labor and material on the northern boundary on Harlan's end. C. He wasn't taking anything. He was proposing an exchange. C. Harlan listened without interrupting. C. When Gideon was done. C. The old man stood quietly for a moment. C. Looking out past him at the property. C. And Gideon waited. C. That's a fair offer, Harlan said at last. Fairer than I'd have expected. C. I've had some help thinking through what fair looks like, Gideon said, and the statement was honest even if it was incomplete. C. They didn't shake hands that day. Harlan said he needed to sit with it, which Gideon respected, but when Gideon rode home, he felt the particular satisfaction of a problem that had been stuck for 6 months beginning to move. C. It wasn't solved, but it was moving. He thought about telling Clara on Wednesday. C. He thought about how she'd respond that specific nod, the slight satisfaction she tried not to show, but showed anyway. C. He caught himself constructing the conversation in his head, her questions and his answers, the back and forth they developed over weeks of walking fence lines together. C. He caught himself doing it and stayed with the awareness of it for a moment. C. He was already living part of his life in conversations with her that hadn't happened yet. C. He didn't know when that had started. He didn't know how to stop it. C. He was not sure he wanted to. She came on Wednesday with color in her face from the ride and a specific expression that told him she'd been thinking about something on the way over. C. I owe you an honest statement, she said, before they'd gotten more than 10 steps from the fence post. C. And I've been deciding whether to make it, and I've decided I'm going to, so here it is. C. He stopped walking, turned to face her. I don't come here because the land is interesting, Clara said. C. The land is interesting. The ranch work is interesting. C. But that's not why I come. She held his gaze with the directness that was simply how she existed in the world, not as a weapon, just as a fact about her. C. I come because I want to be here, because being here feels like the opposite of being somewhere I don't belong. C. And I think you know that. And I think you've been deciding what to do with it for a while, and I think you're going to keep deciding indefinitely, unless I say something. C. Gideon stood very still, so Clara said, Now you know. C. The moment hung there the way moments do when something has been put into words that can't be put back. C. The old Gideon, the 12 years alone Gideon, the surviving Gideon reached for the list of warnings. C. Winter, distance, isolation, the gap between what she thought she wanted and what the reality of it would feel like in February. C. He could feel the words forming. He knew them well. C. He'd rehearsed them in some version or another for years. C. Clara, he started. If you're about to tell me what I want, she said quietly, I need you to stop. C. He stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. The afternoon sat around them and said nothing and gave no advice and offered no easy exit. C. I hear what you're saying, he said, and he meant it. C. All of it, every word of it, including the parts that sat under the words she'd actually used. C. Good, she said, because I meant it. She didn't push further. C. She didn't need to. She'd placed the thing on the table between them in clear light, and now it was visible, and what happened next was going to depend entirely on whether Gideon Mercer was willing to stop pretending he didn't see it. C. They walked the fence line. They talked about the Harlan situation. C. She listened to his account of the conversation with the old man and nodded at the right places and asked the right questions. C. Everything was the same as it always was, except the thing on the table was still there when she rode away. C. And this time, standing in the yard watching the trail after her horse had disappeared past the tree line, Gideon did not reach for probably. C. He did not reach for fear dressed up as caution. He just stood there with the full unmanaged weight of what he felt and let it be what it was. See, he still didn't know what to do with it, but he was done pretending it wasn't there. See, that was something. After 12 years of alone, it was more than something. See, it was the first honest ground he'd stood on in longer than he could easily remember, and it hurt the way honest ground always hurts when you've been standing on something softer for too long. See, he went back to work. But the table in his mind still had something on it, and the chair across from his was no longer quite as empty as it had always been. See, the thing on the table stayed there all through the following week. See, Gideon worked. That was what he did when something was pressing on him that he couldn't solve with his hands. He worked harder, as if exhaustion might metabolize the problem the way it metabolized everything else. See, he repaired the section of east fence that the storm had knocked down. See, he hauled water to the north pasture. He spent 2 full days sorting through the hay situation and doing the kind of math that didn't have a good answer no matter how many times you ran it. See, he worked from before light until after dark, and when he finally came inside and sat at the table with whatever he'd thrown together for supper, the thing Clara had said was still sitting right where she'd left it. See, he was done pretending he didn't see it. He'd told himself that, standing in the yard watching the trail after she'd gone. See, but knowing you're done pretending and actually stopping are different distances apart, and the gap between them was where Gideon lived most of his life. See, Wednesday came. She came with it. This time she brought a book, a small one, a farming almanac she'd mentioned before, with a section on water management she'd marked because she thought it might be relevant to the creek situation. See, she handed it to him at the fence post, before they'd said more than hello, like she'd been thinking about it on the ride over and wanted to get it out of her hands. See, he looked at the marked page. She'd written a small note in the margin, her handwriting, small and precise, that said, "See if this matches your north pasture slope." See, he stood there looking at that marginal note longer than he should have, because it was such a specific and ordinary thing to do, writing notes in margins about his north pasture slope, and the specificity of it sat in his chest like a coal. "See, thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "See, the math only works if your slope is less than 8 degrees. See, I don't know your slope. I'll measure it. Let me know what you find." See, they walked. They talked. Everything was the same as it always was, and underneath everything was the conversation from last Wednesday sitting quietly like something that has been said and cannot be unsaid. See, present in every sentence that came after it without being mentioned directly. See, he noticed she didn't push. She'd put the thing on the table and she was letting it sit. See, not with impatience, with the steadiness of someone who has done what they came to do and is willing to let the rest move at its own pace. See, he didn't know whether that made it easier or harder. See, both probably. When she left that afternoon, he stood in the yard and watched the trail, and this time he let himself think it clearly, with both eyes open. He loved her. See, not the cautious, hedged, maybe this might be version of the feeling. See, the actual thing. The version that sat in your sternum and changed the quality of the light and made a table with one chair feel like a different kind of loneliness than it had before. See, he loved her, and he was terrified, and the terror was dressed up so well as concern for her that he'd almost convinced himself they were the same thing. See, almost. It was a Friday in early October when everything cracked open. See, he'd come into Redwillow for supplies, wire and salt, and some medicine for the remaining sick calf that hadn't fully turned the corner, and he'd gone to Bellamy's the way he always went to Bellamy's. See, and Clara was at the counter, and there was also a man at the counter. See, the man was maybe 40, broad through the shoulders, well dressed in the way of someone who'd made his money recently enough to still feel the need to show it. See, he was leaning on the counter talking to Clara with the ease of someone who was comfortable taking up space. And Clara was listening to him with the expression she used when she was being professionally courteous, attentive, but not actually present. See, the same way she'd looked at Gideon in the first months before she'd started actually seeing him. See, Gideon came through the door. The man looked up with the mild, assessing glance of some sizing up whether a new arrival mattered. See, he apparently decided Gideon didn't, because he returned his attention to Clara without changing his expression. See, as I was saying, the man continued, the Millhaven operation has grown to a point where the accounting needs are well past what one man can manage. See, your father mentioned you have a particular head for numbers. See, my father is generous in his descriptions, Clara said. See, her eyes had moved to Gideon when he'd come through the door. See, they stayed there for a moment before returning to the man in front of her. See, Edward Graves, the man said, turning slightly toward Gideon with the professional courtesy of someone who doesn't intend to start being rude and doesn't intend to stop being central. See, you're a customer here? I am, Gideon said. Graves has a dry goods operation over in Millhaven, Clara said, with the particular flatness of someone reciting a fact they've already recited several times today. See, growing fast, Graves said, returning to Clara with the confidence of a man who is used to being the most interesting thing in a room. See, I was telling Miss Bellamy that the position I have in mind would suit someone with her abilities considerably better than keeping accounts for a general store. He said it without cruelty. See, that was almost worse. It was the dismissal of a man who simply hadn't considered that what he was dismissing might matter. See, Clara's expression didn't change. My father's store is where I work, she said. See, and I'm good at it, of course, Graves said. I only mean that your skills could work at a larger scale. See, more opportunity. Better, he paused, finding the word. See, prospects. There was a brief silence, the kind of silence that has a specific pressure in it. See, Gideon set his supply list on the counter, not deliberately. See, it was simply what he'd come to do, and standing still while another man talked about Clara's prospects felt worse than moving. See, Clara looked at the list. She looked at Gideon. Something passed between them, not words, nothing so clear as words, but something that acknowledged the particular awkwardness of the current moment and the longer story underneath it. See, I'll get your order together, she said to Gideon. See, then to Graves, I appreciate the conversation. I'll think about what you've said. See, it was a dismissal that sounded like a courtesy, which was a skill Gideon had watched her use before. See, Graves received it without recognizing it, which told you something about Graves. See, he said his goodbyes with the confidence of a man who expects his offers to be accepted eventually, and departed with the door closing solid behind him. See, the store was quiet. Clara began pulling items from the shelf behind her, her back to Gideon. See, how often does he come in? Gideon asked. That's the second time, she said, without turning around. See, my father encouraged the first visit. Your father is practical, Gideon said, echoing Margaret Holt's words without meaning to. See, Clara turned around then, with 2 spools of wire in her hands, and looked at him with an expression he couldn't read completely. See, my father wants what's best for me. That's different from knowing what it is. See, what do you think is best for you? The question came out before he'd checked it, and it landed in the space between them with a weight he hadn't intended. See, she set the wire spools on the counter. I think that's a question I've been answering for 2 months, she said carefully, and I'm not certain you've been listening. See, the words weren't angry. They were worse than angry, they were tired. See, the specific tiredness of someone who has been saying the same true thing in different ways, and beginning to wonder whether it's the saying that's the problem or the receiving. See, Gideon felt that like a hand closing around something in his chest. See, he paid for his supplies, he loaded the wagon, he drove home. See, he didn't sleep that night. Not well, anyway. See, he lay in the dark, listening to the particular silence of a ranch at night, the animals settling, the wind against the boards. See, the creak of a building that was old enough to have its own voice, and he thought about Clara's face when she'd said, I'm not certain you've been listening. See, she was right. That was the thing that kept landing and re-landing every time he pushed it away. See, she was completely right. She'd been saying the same thing in 15 different ways since the first Wednesday she'd ridden up his trail without an excuse, and he'd been listening to the words, but not to the meaning. See, because listening to the meaning required him to do something with it. See, he thought about Graves. Well-dressed, comfortable, growing operation in Millhaven. See, the kind of man who offered prospects, which was a word that meant a future that looked like what other people expected a future to look like. See, town. Comfort. Legibility. A woman like Clara keeping accounts for an operation that could actually use her full capacity, not a general store in a frontier settlement. See, he didn't resent Graves. That was the honest truth. See, he couldn't even fault Clara's father for being practical. See, they were looking at Clara's life from the outside and doing the math the way sensible people did the math, and the math made sense. See, it just didn't account for what Clara had actually said she wanted. See, and neither, if he was going to stand in the full light of it, had he. See, he'd spent 2 months letting her come to him, letting her say the things she said. See, letting her place honesty on the table between them, and he'd stood there and protected himself with concern for her welfare, and called it consideration, and it was not consideration. See, it was fear. His own specific 12 years developed fear of wanting something real and losing it. See, he'd been protecting himself from losing her by making sure he never fully had her, which was the most sophisticated form of self-destruction he'd managed in a lifetime of fairly impressive self-destruction. See, he stared at the ceiling of his bedroom for a long time. See, he thought about Dora Shields, who had gone to town and married a feed merchant. See, he thought about Ruth Compton, who had been polite rather than interested. See, he thought about 12 winters in this house, with 1 chair at the table and no lamp in the window when he came in from the dark. See, and then he thought about Clara at his fence post on the first Wednesday, asking genuine questions about the herd rotation. See, Clara in his barn with the account ledgers, finding places where his numbers were working against him. See, Clara riding beside him along the north fence line in the August heat, not complaining, not performing, just present. See, Clara looking at the Harlan property and seeing not an obstacle, but a problem 2 people could solve together. See, he thought about the note in the margin of the almanac. See if this matches your north pasture slope. He sat up in bed. See, he sat there in the dark for a while with his hands on his knees, breathing the cold night air that came in through the gap in the window frame he'd been meaning to fix since last spring. See, he was an idiot. Not a dramatic idiot, not a grand tragic idiot, just an ordinary one. See, the kind that looks at something good and finds 5 reasons to not trust it because trusting it would require actually reaching for it, and reaching was the part he was bad at. See, he'd been bad at reaching since the moment reaching stopped being guaranteed to work, which was around age 23, and he'd gotten so accustomed to not reaching that he'd started calling it wisdom. See, it was not wisdom, it was a 12-year-old wound that he'd been treating like a character trait. See, he went to Redwillow the next morning. See, not for supplies. He'd just been for supplies. See, he went because he'd lain awake most of the night, with the certain knowledge that if he waited for Wednesday, there was a real possibility that something he could not afford to lose would be significantly further away by the time Wednesday arrived. See, and the distance might be his fault, and it might not be reversible. See, he tied his horse in front of the store and went inside. See, Clara was at the counter. See, she looked up when he came in, and the small window-opening shift of her expression happened before she could stop it. And then she did stop it because she was also a person who was tired of hoping for something that kept not arriving. See, and self-protection is something you learn from necessity. See, Gideon, she said. Careful. Level. I need to say something, he said. See, she waited. That was what she did. She gave him the silence to fill. Same as always, because she was constitutionally incapable of filling it for him, and wise enough to know that this was his work to do. See, you've been right, he said. About most of it. The creek. See, the fence, the accounts. And about he stopped. Started again. See, about what you've been saying. The real thing. You've been saying it since July, and I've been receiving it wrong. See, Clara's expression hadn't changed exactly, but the quality of her stillness had shifted. See, the way a room shifts when a window opens that's been closed all winter. See, I've been telling myself I was being careful for your sake, he said. See, that I didn't want you to make a decision based on incomplete information. See, that you didn't fully understand what you'd be choosing. He held her gaze because this was the part that required him to not look away. See, that was a lie, not a deliberate one, but a lie. See, she didn't speak. I was protecting myself, he said. See, every time I warned you about thy isolation, the winters, the distance, I was protecting me. See, not you. You know what you're looking at. You've known since the first time you asked me about the pasture rotation. See, you didn't need my warnings, I needed them. See, because if I warned you enough times, see, and you still stayed, see, then I'd know it was real, see, and he stopped again. See, and if I could keep it from being real long enough, I wouldn't have to risk it being real and losing it. See, something was happening in Clara's face. He couldn't name it precisely. See, it was not anger, though there was something in it that had been anger. See, it was not relief, though there was something in it that was moving toward relief the way a tide moves slowly with the weight of a lot of water behind it. See, that is the most honest thing you've said to me, she said. See, her voice was quiet. In all of this, I know, he said. See, I'm sorry it took this long to get there. She was quiet for a moment. See, it took what it took, she said finally. You're here now. See, he looked at her across the counter. I know I haven't given you much to work with. See, in terms of, he almost reached for a word and then decided the plain one was better. See, in terms of showing you I can actually do this. Be present. See, talk about the real thing instead of talking around it. See, no, she said, you haven't. The agreement wasn't cruel. See, it was the kind of honest that you can only get from someone who respects you enough to not pretend. See, I'd like to do better, he said. I'm asking for the chance. See, Clara looked at him for a long moment. The store was quiet around them, a Tuesday morning, no other customers, her father somewhere in the back, going through inventory by the sound of it. See, I'm not going to pretend that's enough on its own, she said carefully. See, words are easy. You've had the words for a while. See, I know. What I need to see is whether the words and the actions are the same person. See, that's fair, he said. It's going to take some time, she said. See, I'm not closing the door, but I'm also not, she paused, finding it. See, I'm not going to keep riding out to that ranch every Wednesday on the hope that you'll eventually decide whether I'm worth the risk. See, I've done that. That part's done. The words hit him the way a correctly placed blow hits, not so surprising exactly, but decisive. See, she wasn't leaving. She was simply requiring him to show up differently. See, actually show up. Not wait for her to come to him and carry the weight of the wanting while he stood at a careful distance and decided whether it was safe enough. See, understood, he said. She nodded once. Looked down at the ledger she'd been working on before he came in. See, looked back up. Come by Saturday, she said, not the ranch. See, here for supper. My father cooks on Saturdays when his knee doesn't stop him. See, it was an offer that was also a test. Not a trap, she didn't have traps in her. See, a genuine test of whether he could show up somewhere other than the comfortable territory of his own land, on her terms rather than his, with her father in the room and the whole town available to draw whatever conclusions it chose. See, I'll be there, he said. He meant it. See, for possibly the first time in months, he said a thing to Clara Bellamy without a hedge hidden inside it, and the difference was something he could feel physically, like setting down something he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it had weight. See, Saturday's supper at the Bellamy house was nothing like what Gideon had steeled himself for, which was its own kind of adjustment. See, he'd expected Gerald Bellamy to be measuring him. He'd expected tension, or the particular performance of warmth that's actually cold assessment dressed up for company. See, instead, Gerald Bellamy was a small, sharp-eyed man with a bad knee and a surprisingly dry sense of humor who shook Gideon's hand at the door and said, "You're the rancher." See, Clara talks about your water situation more than I think either of you realize. See, Gideon didn't know what to say to that, so he said it's a real situation. See, apparently, Gerald said, and showed him inside. The house was modest in the way of people who spend their comfort on things other than appearance books, stacked on the side table, a fire that was doing actual work rather than decorative service. See, a kitchen that smelled like someone cooked in it seriously and often. See, Clara came out of the kitchen with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way of someone who has prepared herself for multiple possible outcomes. See, you came, she said. I said I would, he said. Something in her face acknowledged that and accepted it without making a production of it. See, supper was a long meal. Gerald Bellamy was a man who had opinions about land law, territorial politics, and the systemic failure of the postal service between Redwillow and the county seat. And he expressed all of these opinions with the comfortable confidence of a man who'd been thinking aloud for 60-odd years and saw no reason to stop. Gideon found, to his mild surprise, that he had opinions on some of these subjects too. The conversation moved. It wasn't a performance for anyone's benefit, it was just 3 people at a table with enough between them to talk about. Clara said less than either of them, which was unusual for her. She mostly ate and listened, and occasionally added something specific and pointed that shifted the whole conversation slightly, the way she did a word or a question that turned the current somewhere new. Gideon caught her watching him a few times, not appraising exactly. More like checking something. He didn't pretend not to notice. He met her eyes when she looked, and held them for a moment before the conversation pulled one of them back. And that simple exchange, repeated 3 or 4 times over the course of a meal, said more than the words around it. After supper, Gerald's knee made its opinion about extended sitting clearly enough that he excused himself to his chair by the fire with a book and left them to the kitchen. Clara washed dishes. Gideon dried them, which he offered because it seemed like the obvious thing, and because standing with his hands empty while she worked seemed worse. They stood at the kitchen basin together in a domestic arrangement so ordinary it felt enormous. Your father's good company, Gideon said. He's exhausting, Clara said, and I love him. Those aren't opposites. She glanced at him sideways. He'd used her own words from months ago back at her, and she recognized them, and the corner of her mouth went up just slightly. No, she said. They're not. They washed the rest of the dishes in quiet. Not an uncomfortable quiet, the other kind. The kind that 2 people share when they've stopped needing to fill it with something and can just let it be what it is. I'm going to ride out to talk to Harlan again, Gideon said as he dried the last plate. He sent word he's willing to discuss terms. The fence labor exchange, she said. Partly. I also want to ask him whether he'd consider a longer arrangement. If his son's not coming back, there might be a way to structure something that takes some of the management pressure off him permanently. Not buying him out, just a working arrangement. Clara was quiet for a moment, her hands still in the basin. That's generous. It's practical, he said, and then because he was trying to do better at the honest thing, and it's generous. Both. She looked at him. That expression again, the one he was slowly learning to read, the one that said she was taking inventory of what was in front of her and deciding whether it matched what she'd thought was there. You're different when you're not protecting yourself, she said. He considered that. Am I better or just different? Better, she said without hesitating, though you were never as bad as you thought you were. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. And she handed him the last cup to dry, and outside the kitchen window the October night had come down fully cold and clean. He rode home that night, through a dark that was wide and clear, the stars doing what stars do in Montana once the season turns, which is exist with an intensity that makes you feel both very small and very present. He was cold by the time he reached the ranch. He'd forgotten his heavier coat, which was exactly the kind of practical failure he made when his attention was somewhere other than where it usually lived. He stabled his horse and went inside. The house was dark and cold the way it always was when he came in after dark. He lit the lamp and got the stove going and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the particular silence of a place that has only one person in it. He set 2 cups on the shelf. He wasn't sure why he did it. They'd been in the back of the cabinet for a while. He had them. Had always had them. They'd just never had a particular use. He stood them side by side on the shelf where he'd see them in the morning. It was a small thing, possibly stupid. The kind of thing a man does when he's not sure of the outcome, but is finally, at 43 years old, choosing to act like the outcome he wants is worth preparing for. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in weeks. Wednesday came and went without Clara riding up the trail, which was what she'd said that part was done. Her coming to him and carrying the weight of it. He'd known that. He'd agreed to it. He still felt her absence on the trail like a physical thing, which told him something about how accustomed he'd gotten to watching for her horse. See, he rode into Redwillow on Thursday instead. Not for supplies. See, just to see her, which was its own kind of new thing going somewhere because he wanted to, not because the ranch required it. See, she was at the counter. She looked up. The window opened. See, you came, she said, in the same tone she'd used on Saturday, which meant she'd noticed and was acknowledging it. See, I said I would, he said, which was the same answer he'd given Saturday, which meant he was aware that the pattern was forming and was choosing to form it. See, she smiled, not the professionally courteous smile, not the careful one, the real one, which was slightly crooked on the left side and went all the way to her eyes and was not performed for anyone's benefit. See, how's the north pasture slope, she asked. 7.5 degrees, he said. See, the almanac method will work then, with some adjustments for the soil drainage. See, I worked it out. Show me Saturday, he said, if your father's knee is better. See, his knee is always convenient, she said. But yes. See, Saturday. He stayed for half an hour. They talked about the Harlan terms, which were moving towards something workable, and about the upcoming winter and what it was likely to do. See, and about a complaint her father was drafting to the territorial office regarding the road maintenance situation east of town, which Gerald Bellamy had strong feelings about and was not shy in expressing. See, when Gideon left, he walked out into the October afternoon feeling something he didn't have a precise word for. See, not happiness exactly, or not only that, something steadier. See, the feeling of a man who has stopped running from the direction he actually wants to go. See, he untied his horse. He was about to mount when he heard his name. See, he turned. Clara was in the doorway of the store, her hand on the frame, the afternoon light making something particular of her face. See, Gideon, she said. Yes? She looked at him for a moment with the expression that preceded her saying a true thing. See, for what it's worth, she said. I didn't ride out to your ranch all those Wednesdays because I was hoping you'd figure it out eventually. She paused. See, I came because being near you was already worth the ride. See, even when you were terrible at all of this, he stood with his hand on his horse's neck and felt the words land in the place they were meant for. See, I was pretty terrible, he said. Impressively, she said. See, but she was smiling. He rode home. The trail was long and familiar, and the same as it had always been, and nothing about the ranch was different when he arrived, the barn still weathered. See, the east fence still needing attention in 2 places, the hay still a problem he hadn't fully solved. See, but the 2 cups were on the shelf when he walked in, and he looked at them for a moment before he got the stove going, and the house felt less like a place he was surviving, and more like a place he was living in. See, it was not a small distinction. He just hadn't been able to feel the difference until now, because you cannot feel the difference between surviving and living until you have something to live toward. And for the first time in 12 years, see, Gideon Mercer had stopped protecting himself from wanting one. See, which meant, of course, that what came next was going to require every bit of courage he had, because the distance between this and what he actually wanted was still considerable. See, and the ground between here and there was not the kind you could cross by working harder. See, it was the kind you crossed by showing up, day after day, Thursday after Thursday, Saturday after Saturday. See, with both cups on the shelf and no guaranteed outcome, and the full weight of hope sitting in your chest where the armor used to be. See, he'd survived 12 years of frontier hardship. He suspected this was going to be harder. See, he suspected, for the first time in a long time, that it was going to be worth it. See, he showed up on Saturday, and the Saturday after that. See, and the Thursday between them, and the one after. He rode into Redwillow, not because the ranch needed something, but because he had decided in the quiet, unannounced way he made most of his real decisions that showing up was the work now. See, and he was going to do it the way he did every other kind of work, consistently, without waiting to feel ready, without requiring a guaranteed outcome before he put in the effort. See, it was harder than fence work, he could say that honestly. See, with fence work, you know where the line is supposed to go. See, you know when a post is set and when it isn't. You know what finished looks like. See, this had none of those markers. See, every Thursday he rode into town, and every Saturday he sat at Gerald Bellamy's table, and every time he left, he had no clear measure of whether the distance between where he was and where he wanted to be had shortened or stayed the same. See, and that uncertainty was its own kind of exhausting for a man who had organized his entire adult life around problems he could solve by application of sufficient effort. See, Clara, for her part, did not make it easy on him in the way of someone handing out reassurance freely. See, that wasn't who she was. She was warm, genuinely warm. See, in the specific way of a person who doesn't waste warmth on performance and means it when it's there, but she was also a woman who had ridden 12 miles of trail on a series of Wednesdays and placed her honesty on the table and been, see, received badly, and that experience had left a mark. See, not a bitterness. Something more like a careful attention to whether what she was seeing now was real, or whether it was the version of real that people produce temporarily under pressure and then abandon when the pressure eases. See, she was watching whether he would keep showing up when there was no drama requiring it. See, when it was just ordinary weeks and ordinary days, and nothing between them except the choice to be present. See, he kept showing up. The Harlan negotiation concluded on a Tuesday morning in the third week of October. See, Gideon had ridden over twice more after the first real conversation, and by the third visit they'd arrived at that suited both of them well enough that neither man felt he'd lost something. See, creek access in exchange for fence labor on the shared boundary. With a supplementary arrangement that Gideon had added at the last minute, he'd spend one day a month through winter helping Harlan work his south pasture, see, which the old man couldn't manage efficiently alone since his son had gone. See, Harlan had looked at that addition for a long moment. See, you don't have to do that, he said. I know, Gideon said. See, I've got the days. Harlan shook his hand with the grip of a man who doesn't shake hands lightly and has learned to mean it when he does. See, the deal was done. Riding home, Gideon felt the specific satisfaction of a problem solved correctly, not just solved, but solved in a way that left the other party in better shape than he'd found them. See, that was Clara's influence, and he knew it, and he didn't mind knowing it. See, some things you learn from experience, and some things you learn from a person who stands at a different angle than you do and shows you what you've been missing. See, both were real learning. Only a fool kept score between them. See, he stopped by the store on his way back through town. See, Clara looked up from the ledger. The window opened. See, Harlan agreed, Gideon said. She set her pen down. See, all of it? All of it. Plus the winter days. Something moved through her expression, not surprise, because she'd thought he could do it, but genuine pleasure at being right. See, how'd he take the extra offer, like a man who needed it and didn't know how to ask? See, she nodded slowly. That's most people. He stood at the counter for a moment. See, he'd said what he came to say. He could leave. He also didn't particularly want to leave, which was itself an ordinary miracle, the simple fact of not wanting to be somewhere other than where he was. See, I told him, Gideon said, that the idea for structuring it as a mutual arrangement rather than a transaction came from someone with a better eye for what fair looks like than I have. See, Clara looked at him. You didn't have to say that. See, I know. It was true. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she needed to. See, and what was in her face during that moment was something he was still learning to read, something that had been building over the past 3 weeks of Thursdays and Saturdays, and ordinary conversations in a store and at a kitchen table. See, something that was moving toward him at its own pace and couldn't be hurried. See, supper Saturday, she said. My father wants to hear about the Harlan terms. See, he has opinions about riparian rights. Your father has opinions about everything. See, it's one of his better qualities, she said. He rode home with the creek access settled and the winter work arranged, and the knowledge that Saturday was 4 days away, and he would be there. See, and that being there was no longer a performance of good intent. It was just where he was going because it was where he wanted to be. See, November came in cold and fast, the way it did in that part of Montana, arriving before October had finished clearing its things. See, the ranch shifted into winter mode, which meant longer days and shorter light and a specific quality of urgency to every task, not the urgency of crisis, but the urgency of a clock you couldn't stop. See, because whatever wasn't done before the hard freeze was going to wait until spring. See, and waiting until spring had consequences you could measure in livestock and money and the kind of exhaustion that comes from digging out of holes that didn't have to be as deep as they got. See, Gideon worked hard. He also kept riding into Redwillow. See, he told himself, honestly, that the two things were not in conflict. The ranch needed him, and Clara needed him to show up, and neither requirement canceled the other. See, what it meant in practice was that he was getting less sleep than was probably wise in running on the particular fuel that comes from wanting something enough that your body cooperates with your intentions more than it might otherwise. See, the Saturday suppers at the Bellamy house had become a fixed thing. See, not formally arranged, not discussed as such, just present in the week, the way the feeding schedule and the water rounds were present, a thing that happened at its time without requiring negotiation. See, Gerald's knee went bad enough in early November that he stopped cooking on Saturdays and started receiving supper instead. See, Clara cooked. Gideon came. Gerald sat in his chair by the fire and offered a commentary on everything from the territorial land situation to the way Clara was seasoning the stew. See, which she received with the patient impatience of a daughter who has long since accepted that her father's opinions come with the man. See, one Saturday in the second week of November. See, after Gerald had fallen asleep in his chair with a book open on his chest, a thing he did with the reliability of a man who has decided that consciousness is optional after 8, in the evening Gideon and Clara sat at the kitchen table with the remains of supper between them and the stove, putting out a heat that made the room feel like a different country from the cold outside. See, it was quiet. The specific, comfortable quiet he'd been finding more often in her company lately, the kind that didn't need filling. See, can I ask you something? Clara said, as she looked at her cup. See, then at him. What changed? Between before, when you were finding reasons, and now? See, he thought about it seriously, because it was a serious question, and she deserved a serious answer rather than the easy version. See, I stopped confusing what I was afraid of with what I was protecting you from, he said. See, those were always two different things. I just kept them in the same pocket. See, she was quiet for a moment. That's a harder thing to admit than most people manage. See, I had help seeing it, he said. You were fairly direct. See, I was, she agreed. I wasn't sure it was going to work. See, it didn't immediately. No, a pause. But it did eventually. See, it did. She looked at him across the table in the firelight and the kitchen quiet, and Gideon felt the full weight of where they were, not just in this room, but in the longer story. See, the one that had started with a supply list and a calculation error, and a woman who could find an 18-pound discrepancy in 4 seconds, and had turned out to be the most significant person he'd encountered in 12 years of frontier life. See, he had not said that to her, not in those words, not plainly. See, he'd shown up, he'd talked honestly, he'd done the work of being present, but the specific central true thing, the thing that had been sitting in his chest since the summer, he had not yet found the words to put into the open air between them. See, he looked at her, looking at him. Clara, he said. See, Gideon, she said. He almost smiled at that, their habit of echoing each other's names like punctuation, something they'd developed without meaning to over months of conversation. See, I want to say something, he said. All right. He took a breath. See, he stopped. Started differently, being here. See, at this table with you. This is the best part of my week. See, every week. Not the best part of the difficult weeks. See, every week. The good ones, too. She was very still. See, I'm not saying that because I think I owe you a declaration, he said. See, I'm saying it because it's true, and I've been circling around the true thing for a long time, and I'm tired of circling. See, what is the true thing, she asked quietly. That I love you, he said. See, that I've known it since about August, And I've been doing everything I could think of to not have to say it directly, because saying it directly means I've put it somewhere you can either take it or leave it. And that's, he exhaled. See, that's the part I don't have a tool for. Clara looked at him for a long time. See, the fire made small sounds in the stove. Gerald breathed evenly in his chair in the other room. See, that's the part nobody has a tool for, she said. See, her voice was careful in the way of someone choosing what to do with something fragile that's been placed in their hands. See, that's the part you just have to do without one. See, he waited. I love you too, Gideon, she said. I have for a while. See, you were very slow. He laughed, a real one, the kind that comes out before you can manage it. See, I know. Impressively slow. You said that before. See, about me being terrible at this, it bears repeating. See, but she was smiling, and it was the real smile, the slightly crooked left side one that went all the way to her eyes, and the space across the table between them felt both very large and like something that was about to change. See, nothing dramatic happened immediately after that. See, that was the honest truth of it. They didn't suddenly become a different story. See, they became a clearer version of the same story. The visits continued, the suppers continued, the conversations continued, but with the weight of the unsaid thing finally lifted, everything breathed differently. See, he could look at her directly without managing what was in his face. See, she stopped the slight, self-protective neutral she'd been keeping in her expression like a contingency plan. See, it was better, considerably better. In the ordinary daily, this what life actually feels like way that is quieter than dramatic, but outlasts it by decades. See, he started talking about the ranch differently, not explaining why she would hate it. See, just talking about it, the problems and the solutions and the things he was thinking about for spring, the way you talk to someone you expect to be there in the conversation with you, not someone you're preparing to lose. See, she started asking about the ranch differently too. See, not learning it the way you learn something interesting, but foreign. See, learning it the way you learn something you intend to know for a long time. See, one Thursday she asked him how the kitchen was set up. See, he blinked. The kitchen? At the ranch. Is the stove in good condition? My father's been thinking about upgrading ours, and if it's the same model, I'd be curious whether you've had the same problem with the left burner. See, he looked at her. She looked at him with complete composure. See, it's a practical question. It is, he said. The stove is fine. See, left burner works. Good to know, she said, and went back to the ledger. See, he rode home thinking about that question for the entire 12 miles. See, December arrived, and with it the first real snow, which came on a Thursday night and left 8 inches on the ground by Friday morning and changed everything about the logistics of both the ranch and the road between the ranch and Redwillow. See, Gideon spent the first 3 days of the snow doing the 100 immediate things that a working ranch required in the first heavy snowfall of the season. See, he did not get to Redwillow. He sent a brief note with a passing rider explaining that the conditions were making travel slower, which was understating things considerably. But he didn't want her to think the snow had changed what Thursday meant. See, she sent a note back. It arrived Saturday afternoon via the same rider heading back west. See, it said, the roads are terrible. Don't ride in bad conditions on my account. See, I know where you are. Those last 4 words. I know where you are. See, he read them twice and then folded the note and put it in his coat pocket where it stayed for the rest of the week. See, he got to Redwillow the following Thursday. Roads improved enough to make the ride sensible, and when he walked into the store, Clara looked up and said simply, "Good," and meant it, and that single word contained enough to fill a longer sentence. See, your father's knee, he asked. Mending. The cold doesn't help. See, I brought something for it. He set a small paper-wrapped parcel on the counter. See, the liniment the veterinarian uses for joint inflammation in the horses. See, same compound that the doctor in Billings prescribes for people, according to Harlan, who has the same problem in the other knee, and swears by it. See, Clara looked at the parcel, looked at him. You asked Harlan about his knee. See, I asked him what he'd found useful. He told me. She was quiet for a moment. See, My father is going to have a complete opinion about receiving horse liniment as medicine. See, tell him it's human liniment that happens to also work on horses. See, that's technically true? Technically, yes. She picked up the parcel. See, he'll still have an opinion. He has opinions about everything, Gideon said. See, it's one of his better qualities. She looked at him. See, the real smile came, and this time it came quickly, without the previous caution, as if it no longer needed to wait and see whether it was safe to arrive. See, it was a Saturday in the third week of December when Margaret Holt made her final appearance. See, Gideon was leaving the Bellamy house after supper. Gerald had made it to the table that week, knee cooperating, and had held forth for 45 minutes about the liniment. See, which he'd tried, and which had worked, and which he was determined to have mixed feelings about on principle. See, Clara had watched her father's determined ambivalence with visible amusement, and Gideon had kept a straight face as long as he could, which was not as long as he'd hoped. See, he was coming down the front steps when Margaret Holt came around the corner of the adjacent building. See, whether she'd been watching for him or whether it was genuine coincidence, he could not tell. See, he suspected the former. Mercer, she said. He stopped. See, looked at her. She was wearing her good coat, the heavy wool one that her husband's money had imported from somewhere east. See, and she had the expression of a woman who has prepared something to say and intends to say it regardless of how the terrain has changed since she prepared it. See, I've been watching this, she said, gesturing vaguely at the Bellamy house. See, all fall. I know, he said. I want you to understand something. She paused. See, then with a shift in her expression that he hadn't expected, not softer exactly, but less armored, she said, I was wrong. See, what I said in the store last summer. He waited. See, I was wrong about what Clara would or wouldn't choose, Margaret continued. See, I thought I was protecting her. I was protecting something else. See, an idea about how things ought to be arranged, and I was wrong. See, it was not a comfortable admission. He could see that. See, it came out with the particular stiffness of someone who doesn't apologize frequently and isn't entirely sure of the right posture for it. See, I appreciate that, he said. And then, because he was trying to be the person he was becoming rather than the one he'd been, for what it's worth, you weren't entirely wrong about the ranch. See, it is hard, it is isolated, the winters are real. See, but she knows that, Margaret said. She's known it since July, he said. See, I was the one who needed to catch up. Margaret Holt looked at him for a moment with an expression that was unreadable in the way of people whose inner life is larger than their social presentation. See, then she nodded once, pulled her coat closer, and walked on down the street. See, he stood on the Bellamy porch steps and watched her go. See, behind him, the door opened. Clara stepped out into the cold, her own coat on, having apparently seen the exchange through the window. See, what did she want? Clara asked. To say she was wrong, he said. See, about us. Clara looked down the street in the direction Margaret Holt had gone. See, she's not entirely a bad person, she said. She just, see, decided things about other people before asking them, Gideon said. See, Clara glanced at him sideways. I recognize the tendency, he said. See, she looked at him for a moment with something in her expression that was very close to affection, not bothering to conceal it. See, yes, she said. I noticed. They stood together in the December cold on her father's porch, their breath visible in the night air, the town of Redwillow doing its quiet evening business around them. See, and it was ordinary in every external sense, two people standing on steps in the cold, and completely extraordinary in the sense that mattered, which was the sense that neither of them was anywhere they didn't want to be. See, I should start for home, he said. The road's going to ice up. See, be careful, she said, not as a pleasantry, as a thing she meant. See, I will. He paused. Clara. Yes. He stood on the bottom step and looked up at her on the porch and said the thing that had been forming for weeks, the thing underneath the thing he'd already said. See, the next layer of the true thing that he'd been approaching from the outside for months. See, I want to talk about what this is, he said. Not tonight. See, when there's time to do it properly. But I want to have that conversation. See, she was very still in the way she went still when something mattered. See, what conversation, specifically? The one about what comes next, he said. See, what we're building, what it looks like. She looked at him for a long moment. See, the cold pressed in around both of them, and the stars above Redwillow were very bright the way they got when the temperature dropped hard. See, yes, she said. I want to have that conversation too. See, he rode home. The road was cold and the dark was complete by the time he reached the ranch boundary. See, and he navigated by familiarity more than sight. 12 years of riding the same trail meant his horse knew it as well as he did and could be trusted to find the way when the light was gone. See, he stabled his horse, went inside, lit the lamp, 2 cups on the shelf. See, he stood looking at them for a moment. See, he'd put them there in October in a small private act of preparation, and they'd been there ever since through November and now into December, standing side by side on the shelf where he'd see them when he came in. See, they were just cups. He was aware of that. But the gesture behind them was not nothing, and the fact that they were still there meant that he had not, in the weeks since placing them, decided to put one back. See, he'd chosen, every time he came in and saw them, to let both of them stay. See, he got the stove going. He sat at the table, 2 chairs now. See, he'd brought a second one up from the back room some weeks ago, telling himself it was practical. He sometimes needed to spread paperwork out and then not spreading any paperwork on it. See, it sat across the table from his own chair, and he'd eaten in front of it every night since, and not found it strange. See, he sat with his hands around his cup and thought about what he wanted to say when they had the conversation he'd named on her porch. See, he'd said what comes next and what we're building, and those were true, but they were also indirect, and he was trying to stop being indirect about important things. See, what he meant was he wanted to marry her. He'd known it for a while in the background, way you know things you're not ready to name yet. See, but naming it now, sitting alone in his kitchen in December, with 2 cups on the shelf and 2 chairs at the table, did not produce the fear he would have expected. See, it produced something quieter, something closer to the feeling of a problem that has been worked on long enough to finally be understood. See, the problem was not whether he wanted to. He wanted to. See, the problem was not whether she was making the choice with full information. She had more information about this ranch and this life and this man than anyone had ever had before making any decision adjacent to him. See, the problem was not even the old fear, the protecting himself dressed as concern for her, because he'd looked that in the face in his bedroom in October and called it what it was, and he was not going back to it. See, the problem, and it was a smaller problem than all the ones that had preceded it, was simply that asking was still asking. See, putting the question into the air and waiting for it to land somewhere. See, there was no version of that without risk. There never had been, and he'd spent 12 years treating the risk as a reason not to ask, rather than what it actually was, which was the price of wanting something real. See, he was willing to pay the price. He was more than willing. See, he was decided. The question was how. He sat with that for a while. See, not anxiously, he'd been anxious enough about enough things for long enough that he was tired of his own anxiety and had begun, in small ways, to just act in spite of it, rather than waiting for it to resolve. See, he sat with the how of it the way you sit with a practical problem, turning it, looking at it from different angles, finding the shape of it. See, he didn't want to make it a performance. That wasn't who he was, and it wasn't who she was. See, and a performance would feel false to both of them, and she would see through it immediately, because she saw through most things immediately, and he had come to appreciate that quality enormously, even when it was directed at his own pretensions. See, he wanted it to be honest, he wanted it to be direct. See, he wanted it to be in a place that meant something, not a place that was designed to be impressive. See, he thought about the fence post where she'd first dismounted in July, back when she'd come up the trail and claimed she happened to be passing through the valley. See, he thought about the barn where she'd sat with his account ledgers and found places where his numbers were working against him. See, he thought about the north fence line in August, walking in the heat, talking about the creek situation like 2 people who were already invested in the same problems. See, he thought about the kitchen table, with Gerald's opinions filling the room, and Clara's patient impatience, and the ordinary, extraordinary thing that had happened at that table over the course of a fall season. See, he thought about the 2 cups on the shelf. He'd been preparing without calling it preparation. See, he'd been building towards something without naming it. See, the cups, the chair, the Harlan arrangement, that was partly a practical solution and partly a preparation for a life that could absorb another person's partnership rather than struggling against it. See, he'd been getting ready, he was ready. The question was still how. See, but the answer to that, he decided, was simpler than he'd been making it. See, he'd been making most things simpler lately by remembering that the direct version was usually the right version, and that he'd wasted a great deal of time in the indirect version and didn't intend to waste more. See, he would ask her, clearly, directly, without a speech designed to impress or a setting designed to perform. See, in a place that was real to both of them, in words that meant exactly what they said. See, he would ask her. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and felt the full weight of what he was going to do and did not feel afraid of it. See, he felt something he had not felt in a long time, something he'd nearly forgotten was available to him. See, he felt like a man with something ahead of him, not just something to survive. See, something to go toward. The distinction was enormous and quiet, and it changed the quality of the dark around him from the dark of a man alone to the dark of a man waiting for morning. See, and those 2 darknesses are not the same thing at all, even when they look identical from the outside. See, he slept. Outside, the Montana winter pressed its cold against the boards of the house, and the stars turned their slow circuit overhead. See, and the ranch sat in its landscape the way it had for 12 years, weathered and real and harder than it looked and full, now, of a future that a cautious man had almost managed to prevent himself from wanting. See, almost. But not quite, and not quite was it turned out exactly enough. See, he did not ask her in December, not because he lost his nerve, or not only that, though he could admit to himself that nerve was a factor. See, he didn't ask in December because he woke up the morning after his decision and understood, with the clarity that sometimes arrives after a night of good sleep following a hard season of bad ones, that the asking was not something to rush. See, not because he was afraid of her answer. See, because he'd spent months getting here, and she'd spent months waiting to see whether he would get here, and what they'd built deserved to be named properly, in a moment that wasn't hurried or cold or tucked between other obligations. See, he wanted to get it right. Not perfect, he'd been done with perfect for a while now, or rather he'd been done with using the pursuit of perfect as an excuse to do nothing. See, but right. Honest and specific and deliberate, the way the things that actually mattered deserved to be done. See, so December passed. Christmas came to Redwillow the way it came to every small settlement that far from everything practically, without extravagance, but with a genuine effort toward warmth in the long dark. See, Gerald Bellamy's store was decorated with the materials available, which were modest. See, and Clara had arranged a string of dried berries along the window ledge that probably looked better to people who knew the limitation of dried berries as decoration than to people who expected something from a city shop. See, Gideon noticed them and thought they looked exactly right. See, he spent Christmas Day at the Bellamy house. Gerald had made a production of cooking, bad knee and all, and received all offers of assistance with the injured dignity of a man who cooked badly, but considered the territory his own. See, the result was a meal that was technically successful and aggressively uneven. The meat was excellent, the gravy was a decision, and the pie had been assembled by someone who understood the concept of pie more than the execution. See, Gideon ate all of it and said it was good because it was Christmas, and Gerald had worked at it, and the spirit of the thing was not negotiable. See, Clara caught his eye across the table while Gerald was explaining, at length, his theory about why the gravy had gone the direction it had. See, her expression was the controlled kind that happens when a laugh is present, but company manners are also present, and the 2 are in direct negotiation. See, Gideon kept a straight face. It cost him something. See. After supper, Gerald fell asleep in his chair with the reliability of a man whose body has decided that holiday meals are for resting rather than celebrating. See. And Gideon and Clara sat in the kitchen with cups of coffee and the comfortable quiet that had become, over the fall, one of his favorite things in his life. See. This has been a good year, Clara said. She said it simply, without the performance of sentiment, just as a fact she was setting on the table between them. See. He thought about the year, about July and the almanac and the fence lines and the October night he'd sat in the dark and admitted to himself what he felt. See. About November and the Saturday suppers and the liniment for Gerald's knee and the note she'd sent that said, "I know where you are." See. About December and 2 cups on a shelf and a second chair at a table. See, it has, he said. The first half wasn't, she said. See. No, he agreed. The first half I was doing it wrong. See. You were doing your best with what you had available, she said, in the tone of someone who has thought about this and arrived at a conclusion that is more generous than the simpler one. See. That's kind, he said. It's accurate, she said. See. People don't make themselves afraid on purpose. You had reasons for the way you were. See. They were just reasons that had stopped being useful, and you hadn't let go of them yet. See. He looked at her across the table. The lamp made the kitchen warm, and the cold pressed against the window, and Gerald breathed steadily in the other room. See. You've thought about that a lot, he said. I've thought about a lot of things a lot, she said. See. I'm a bookkeeper. I go over the same numbers until they make sense. See. And did we make sense? Eventually. She looked at him. See. Yes, she said, eventually. January was brutal. See. Not unusually so. For that part of Montana, this was simply what January was, a month that meant business and had no interest in how prepared you thought you were. See. The cold went deep and stayed, the kind that cracked wood and froze water in lines you'd insulated and found the gaps in everything you'd been meaning to fix since fall. See. Gideon worked the ranch through it in the way he'd worked through every winter for 12 years. See. Which was to say relentlessly, and with the grim satisfaction of a man who has long since made his peace with difficulty as a fact of life, rather than a complaint to be lodged. See. The Harlan arrangement proved its value immediately. Access to the creek water on the north rotation meant he wasn't hauling as desperately as he would have otherwise. See. And the work he'd put in on the shared fence in November meant that boundary was holding better than it would have. See. He got to Redwillow less. The roads went bad enough in the worst weeks that the ride was genuinely inadvisable, and he knew she knew that because she'd said, "Don't ride in bad conditions on my account," and she'd meant it and would hold him to it. See. He wrote letters instead. He was not, by nature or by practice, a letter writer. See. His handwriting was functional, and his prose was the kind that a man produces when he has been primarily alone for 12 years and has not had much occasion to find out what he thinks about things in the act of writing them down. See. The first letter he wrote was about the creek access and how it was performing in the freeze, which was practical and honest and not particularly romantic. See. The second one went differently. He sat at the table on a January night with the lamp burning and the stove working hard and outside nothing but wind and dark. See. And he meant to write about the hay situation, and instead found himself writing about what the ranch looked like at night in deep winter, the way the snow changed the quality of the dark. See. The way the silence had a different texture than summer silence, heavier and closer. See. He wrote about how he'd spent a lot of years finding that silence oppressive and how it had started, sometime in the fall, to feel different. See. Not loud, but less empty. He stared at what he'd written for a while. See. It was not the kind of thing he usually said, but he was trying to say the real thing more often, and this was real, and she deserved the real things. See. He sent it. Her response came back in 4 days via a rider going east. The silence in town is different too. See. Noisier and somehow lonelier. I've been thinking about that. See. He read it 3 times. He wrote back, "When the roads are passable, I'd like to show you the ranch in winter. See. It's not the same place as summer. I want you to see all of it." See. She wrote back, "I've been waiting for you to ask." See. The roads cleared enough in the first week of February for a careful ride, And on a Thursday afternoon, with the cold still serious, but the sun making its first real effort of the new year, Clara rode out to the ranch. See, not the fence post this time. All the way up the main trail to the yard, where she dismounted and stood looking at the place in its winter version, the barn dusted with frost along the roofline, the snow lying clean and heavy over the fields. See, the cattle visible at the far end of the north pasture as small, dark shapes against white. See, he stood in the yard and watched her take it in. She was quiet for a longer moment than usual. See, not the considering quiet, something more private. See, it's beautiful, she said. And then, before he could respond, I know you're not going to warn me about winter. See, I'm not, he said. Good. She turned to look at him directly. See, because I've ridden 12 miles through it today, and I'm aware of what it involves. See, he felt the laugh before it arrived, which had been happening more lately, humor finding him before he could organize a defense against it. See, come inside. There's coffee. She came inside. See, she stood in the kitchen of the ranch for the first time, looking at it with the same thorough, non-judgmental attention she brought to everything, and he watched her see the 2 cups on the shelf before she saw most other things. See, and whatever her face did in that moment she didn't try to hide. See, you put 2 out, she said, back in October, he said. See, when I decided to stop pretending. She stood looking at the cups for a moment. See, then she turned and looked at him. Gideon, she said. See, yes, that might be the most romantic thing you've ever done. See, it's 2 cups on a shelf. Yes, she said, that's why. See, he made the coffee. She sat at the table, the chair across from his, the one that had been there since October, which she took without asking or commenting, as though it had been hers for a while, and she was simply returning to it. See, he sat across from her. They drank coffee in the kitchen of the ranch, while the February light came through the window at the low angle of a sun that was still working on being useful after a long winter. See, and it was warm enough inside and cold enough outside, and the 2 cups were both being used, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and the least ordinary thing Gideon Mercer had experienced in 12 years. See, I want to show you the north pasture, he said after coffee. See, the creek looks different in winter. I'd like that, she said. See, they walked it after. The snow was heavy enough to require deliberate movement, and the cold was real. See, and nothing about the landscape was the easy version of itself. The fields were hard and white, and the fence posts stood stiff in their footings, and the cattle they passed regarded them with the incurious patience of animals that, see, have decided weather is a fact rather than a problem. See, Clara walked beside him without complaint. She asked about the frozen sections of the creek and whether the Harlan arrangement still functioned in a freeze, which it did, partly, through a gap he'd rigged with insulation in November. See, she asked about 2 calves she could see that looked younger than the rest of the herd, which they were late births that had required some management through December, and which were now doing fine. See, she asked whether the North Pasture's drainage situation, which they'd discussed in the context of the almanac's slope calculations, had performed the way he'd hoped. See, it had. Mostly, they stood at the fence that marked the northern boundary of his property, the Harlan land visible beyond it, the shared section running clean and solid to the east. See, the sky above was the specific white-gray of a February afternoon in Montana, and the light was already beginning its early departure. See, she was looking at the view, he was looking at her. See, he had meant to do this differently, or rather he'd meant to plan it more, to have the specific words prepared in the specific order. See, but standing in the north pasture in February, cold with the woman who had walked every corner of his land and learned every hard fact of his life and chosen to keep showing up anyway. See, the rehearsed version seemed smaller than what the moment actually was. See, Clara, he said. She turned to look at him. I want to ask you something, he said. See, the quality of her stillness changed. He saw her register at what was coming, or something close enough to what was coming that she was already preparing for the weight of it. See, he did not reach for the speech he'd rehearsed in January. See, he just said the true thing. I want you to marry me, he said. See, not because I don't think you could do better. Not because I want to give you something easier than what you have. See, you know what this is. You've walked it in August heat, and you're standing in it in February cold, and you know exactly what the years of it will require. He held her gaze. See, I want to marry you because I love you, and because you're the only person I've ever known who looked at my life without looking for the exit, and because the ranch and I are both better with you in them. See, and because I've got 2 cups on the shelf and a second chair at the table, and I've been ready for you to come home for longer than I knew how to admit. See, Clara stood very still. The wind moved across the pasture and found the gaps in both their coats, and the cold was real and present, and not romantic in any conventional sense, and it was the right place exactly because it was honest. See, and honest was what they had built between them over 7 months of fence lines and kitchen tables and letters in January dark. See, that is considerably better than the first few months, she said. See, her voice was steady, but something in it wasn't, and she wasn't trying to hide that either. See, I've been working on it, he said. I know you have. She looked at him. See, I know exactly how much work that was for you. I want you to know I know that. See, Clara. Yes, she said. He stopped. Yes, she said again, clearly, without qualification, the way she said everything that she meant completely. See, I'll marry you, Gideon Mercer. See, he stood in the snow on the north pasture of the ranch he'd built across 12 years of solitary effort and felt the yes land in his chest like something completing a circuit that had been opened so long he'd stopped expecting it to close. See, he reached across and took her hand. See, she was wearing her riding gloves, and he was wearing his work gloves, and it was not the version of this moment that anyone would write poetry about. 2 people in heavy winter coats holding gloved hands in a frozen pasture. See, it was better than that. It was real in a way that poetry usually isn't, which is to say it was imperfect and cold and absolutely certain. See, we should get inside, he said. You're going to freeze. See, I've been standing in this for 20 minutes, she said. See, another 2 won't end me. Nevertheless, she agreed, and she was smiling, and he was too, and they walked back across the north pasture toward the ranch in the failing February light with their hands together between them. See, they told Gerald that evening. Clara told him directly. See, sitting across from him in his chair by the fire while Gideon stood near the kitchen doorway with the same feeling he'd had since that afternoon of a man who has stepped off a ledge and discovered that the ground was closer. See, than he'd feared and more solid than he'd dared hope. See, Gerald listened. His face went through several things. See, he was a man with opinions about everything and feelings he managed carefully. See, and the combination of those 2 traits meant that moments of genuine emotion came out of him with a stiffness that was not coldness, but the particular awkwardness of someone who loves deeply and has never been entirely comfortable showing it. See, he looked at his daughter for a long moment when she finished talking. See, then he looked at Gideon. You'll take care of her, he said. See, not as a question, as the beginning of something. She doesn't need much taking care of, Gideon said. See, she's capable. She is, Gerald said. Take care of her anyway. See, yes, sir, Gideon said. Gerald nodded. See, he reached out and put his hand briefly on Clara's arm, a small gesture from a man for whom small gestures contained large things, and then picked up his book and put his reading glasses on, and that was Gerald Bellamy's version of being. See, overwhelmed, which was to return to something familiar, while he absorbed the unfamiliar. See, Clara caught Gideon's eye across the room, the real smile. See, he understood, looking at it, that he was going to see that smile for the rest of his life if he did his part, and that doing his part was no longer the frightening prospect it had once been. See, it was simply the next day's work, and the day after that's, and the day after that's. See, sustainable. His kind of thing. They were married in March, when the worst of winter had loosened its grip enough for the roads to be passable and the day to be cold but not cruelly so. See, the ceremony was in Redwillow, at the small building the town used for civic occasions, which was also sometimes used for storage and smelled faintly of both functions. See, there were perhaps 30 people there. Gerald, whose knee was bad but who stood for the whole thing without mentioning it once. See, Harlan, who came in from the east property, looking like a man who had located his good coat after some searching. See, several people from town who had watched the whole story of fall and winter unfold with the interest that small settlements take in the lives of their members. See, which is considerable, and not always kind, but in this case had tipped, gradually, into something more like goodwill. See, Margaret Holt came. She sat in the back row and said nothing before or after, and her expression throughout was the expression of a person who is making peace with something and finding it both harder and more worthwhile than expected. See, Clara acknowledged her with a nod on the way out. Margaret nodded back. See, it was not forgiveness exactly, or not yet, but it was the beginning of something that could become that if both of them chose to let it. See, Gideon stood at the front of that room and watched Clara walk toward him and felt the full, clear, undefended weight of the moment without flinching from it. See, he'd spent a long time flinching. He was done with flinching. See, she was walking toward him in the gray March light. See, wearing the dress she'd made herself from material that Gerald had stocked for years without selling, because he'd been saving it for something important, and had known that this was eventually what it was for. See, and she was looking at him the way she'd been looking at him since the day she'd handed him back his supply list, with the error corrected directly, with full attention, as if he was worth the full attention. See, he met her gaze the whole way. He did not look away. See, the ceremony was short. Both of them had, independently and without discussing it, indicated to the officiant that brevity was preferred over ceremony, see, which resulted in a service that was honest and efficient and exactly right for two people who communicated in plain speech and meant what they said. See, when it was done, Gerald shook Gideon's hand with both of his and said, "The ranch is going to need a better kitchen stove, I expect." See, "We'll see," Gideon said. "It will," Clara said. They were both right. See, the ranch in the weeks after the wedding was the same ranch it had always been and entirely different, which is the way of things that change from the inside rather than the outside. See, the barn was still weather-beaten. The east fence still had 2 sections that needed attention before summer. See, the north pasture water situation was improved but not solved. There were good years ahead and probably hard ones, and the creek access helped but did not transform the fundamental calculus of running cattle through a Montana summer. See, the hay question would return every fall. The road to Redwillow would remain 12 miles. See, none of these things had changed. What had changed was the quality of every one of them. See, not easier, Gideon had not married Clara because he expected the work to get lighter, and she had not come to the ranch because she imagined it would. See, the work was the same work, but the thing you work toward and the person you work beside and the house you return to, those change what work means. See, they change what survival means. They change the whole register of a life from endurance to something with more dimensions than that. See, Clara kept the store's books through March and into April, riding the 12 miles into Redwillow 3 days a week, on a schedule she and Gerald had worked out that suited both of them. See, Gerald needed her, and she knew it, and she was not the kind of person who abandoned what she'd built because her circumstances changed. See, she would keep the books until Gerald could replace her, and she was helping him find someone capable, and that process would take however long it took. See, Gideon did not have opinions about her schedule, or rather he had one opinion, which was that it was her schedule to determine. And that opinion came easily now in a way it would not have come easily 8 months ago. See, which told you something about how much a person could change when they decided to. See, she'd kept the books. She'd kept her mind. He'd kept her out of his decision-making about what she could handle, which was the deal, and the deal was working. See, they ate supper together in the ranch kitchen every night she was there, and sometimes rode back to town when she needed to, and sometimes she stayed, and they had long evenings at the table they'd both started thinking of as theirs. See, talking about whatever was real, the ranch problems, the store situation, Gerald's knee, the Harlan arrangement, books she'd read, things he'd observed about the cattle that week, the slow news of the territory arriving weeks late from the east. See, they argued occasionally. Not explosively, neither of them ran to explosion, but with the specific friction of two people who both think carefully and don't always arrive at the same place. See, she had a view about the east fence that he disagreed with. See, he had a view about the timing of the spring rotation that she pushed back on with 3 specific objections, 2 of which turned out to be correct and 1 of which turned out to matter less than she'd thought. See, these were not crises. They were the texture of a shared life between 2 people who had not given up their separate minds in exchange for harmony. See, he valued it. He'd expected to, and he did. What he hadn't fully expected was the way the ranch responded to 2 people. See, not magically, the fence didn't fix itself. The hay didn't multiply. The winter didn't shorten because there was now someone to share it with. See, but the thinking improved. See, having someone at a different angle consistently, permanently, as a fixture of daily life rather than a Wednesday afternoon, it meant that problems got looked at from more than one direction before they calcified into the only direction. See, he caught himself more. He caught her too, occasionally, when she was running her bookkeeper's logic onto problems that needed a different tool. See, they caught each other. That was the function. It was not the stuff of romantic poetry. See, it was better and more durable than that. See, in May, Harlan came over on a Tuesday with news that his son had written from Wyoming. See, the letter had arrived a week ago and Harlan had been sitting with it before deciding to share it. See, the son was not coming back, he'd said so clearly for the first time, rather than implicitly, but he'd asked whether his father would consider selling the northern 40 acres, which the son had no claim on, but wanted to settle in his own mind. See, Harlan didn't want to sell. He wanted to work it. See, he was 68, and his body was arguing with his intentions on a daily basis. And he was aware that the arithmetic of the situation was not in his favor, but he was not ready to be a man who had given his land to someone else. See, Gideon listened. Then he said, "What if we changed the arrangement? Not a sale. See, a working partnership. You hold the deed. I run the north section jointly with mine. See, shared labor, shared yield on the northern pasture. You keep the water rights and the ownership." See, Harlan looked at him. That's a considerable extension of what we agreed. See, the situation changed, Gideon said. I've got more capacity now than I had in October. See, Harlan looked at Clara, who was sitting at the table with the coffee she'd made when Harlan arrived, because she'd learned very quickly that Harlan talked better when there was coffee and a table and no particular pressure to reach a conclusion. See, he came up with this himself, Clara said. I may have pointed out that you were unlikely to accept charity and would need ramed practically. See, Harlan looked at her for a moment, then he looked at Gideon. See, she's useful, he said, in the tone of a man giving a significant compliment with the minimum available words. See, I know, Gideon said. They worked out the terms over 2 more visits, with Clara's ledger precision applied to the yield calculations, and Gideon's understanding of the land applied to what was actually workable. See, by June, they had an agreement that was fair by any measure, and that left Harlan with his land and his dignity intact, and the north section of the valley running more efficiently than it had in years. See, after Harlan left from the final conversation, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the papers in front of her and said, You know he's going to leave it to you eventually. See, that's not why I did it, Gideon said. I know, she said. See, that's why I said it. He looked at her across the table. See, she was looking back at him with the expression he'd spent months learning to read, the one that was the full version of what she thought, offered without management or reduction. See, you do that, he said. Do what? Say the thing that confirms what I was hoping about myself. See, she considered that. I say the thing that's true, she said. See, it happens to confirm good things about you because you do good things more often than you give yourself credit for. See, I wasted about 7 months of this, he said. You did, she agreed. See, and then you stopped. Both parts are part of it. See, he was quiet for a moment. Outside, the May afternoon was pushing green through everything, the land doing its annual argument against the winter that had occupied it for months. See, the ranch looked different in May. Everything did. See, I spent 12 years deciding nobody would choose this, he said. See, the ranch, the isolation, me, I know, she said. See, I was wrong. You were wrong, she said. It was not unkind. See, it was the simple, clean confirmation who has told the truth for so long it has become the only option she considers. See, thank you, he said, for riding up the trail that first Wednesday. See, thank you, she said, for not running me off when I did. See, he smiled, she smiled. Outside the window, the ranch went about its business in the May light, imperfect and demanding and real. See, there is a particular kind of story that people tell about the frontier, the version where the land is won, and the hardship is overcome, and everything resolves into a neat, triumphant picture. See, as if difficulty is a problem to be defeated rather than a condition to be lived with. See, that was not the story of Gideon Mercer and Clara Bellamy Mercer. See, their story was messier and more honest than that. See, the ranch was still hard. Winters were still long. See, the road to Redwillow was still 12 miles each way, and the 12 miles were different in February than in July. See, Gerald's knee did not improve with any consistency, and he needed more help over time rather than less. See, which Clara provided with the particular combination of patience and exasperation that is specific to loving someone who refuses to be efficiently cared for. See, Gideon remained constitutionally a man who found emotional directness more difficult than physical labor. See, he backslid, occasionally reached for caution when he should have reached for honesty, held something internal when he should have said it aloud. See, Clara noticed every time. She did not let it go unmentioned. See, they had, by the second year, developed a specific exchange that happened when he was circling instead of landing, which was her saying his name in a particular register and him recognizing the register and saying the thing he was circling around. See, and it was not romantic, and it was not effortless, and it was the kind of thing that only works between two people who have decided that working at it is worth the work. See, he never once, after February of 1887, told her what she would or wouldn't want. See, not once. He slipped in other ways, not in that one. See, some things, once you've seen them clearly enough, you can't unsee, and Gideon Mercer had seen that particular thing in himself with the kind of clarity that left a permanent mark. See, Clara continued the store books until the following autumn, when Gerald found a young man from an Eastern family who had come west with better arithmetic than prospects, and who turned out to be, as Clara had predicted he would be, see, entirely competent once someone spent 6 weeks showing him how her system worked. See, she spent those 6 weeks doing exactly that, precisely and without sentimentality, and handed it over cleanly. See, after that she was at the ranch, not trapped there. See, not confined. At the ranch because it was where she had chosen to be, which was a different thing entirely, and which she understood the difference between more clearly than most people ever manage. See, she brought the ledger habits to the ranch accounts and found 6 places in the first month where the spending structure was working against itself. See, she brought the creek almanac calculations to the spring rotation, and the improvement in water management over that summer was measurable. See, she brought, most importantly, the consistent presence of a second mind at a different angle than the first. See, and the ranch and the man running it were both better for it, in ways that accumulated invisibly over time and were understood better in retrospect than in the moment. See, that is how most real improvements work, not as transformations. See, as accumulations. One evening in the second autumn October again, the year coming around to where so much of it had started, they rode the south pasture fence line together at the end of a long day's work. See, the light was the October amber that Gideon had spent 12 years watching alone, and the grass was the October dry gold. See, and the fence line ran straight and solid in both directions because they'd worked it together earlier in the month when a section had come loose after a hard night's wind. See, Clara was riding beside him, close enough that their horses occasionally drifted to within a foot of each other and then corrected the easy movement of animals accustomed to each other's company. See, she was looking at the land, he was looking at her, looking at it. See, do you ever regret it? He asked. Not anxiously, from genuine curiosity, the kind that comes from knowing someone well enough to actually want to know. See, She glanced at him. The ranch? Any of it. She thought about it the way she thought about everything seriously, without rushing to the easy answer. See, I regret that you were difficult for so long, she said. See, not because it wasn't worth it, because it was, and I still had to do it anyway, and it was hard. She paused. See, but no, I don't regret being here, even in February. See, especially not in February, she said. February is when you find out what you actually think about something. See, easy decisions are made in July. The real ones are made in February. See, he looked at her. You made yours in January, she said. See, sitting alone in your kitchen, deciding you were going to ask me. See, in the cold and the dark, with no guarantee, she looked at him directly. See, that's what I wanted to know you were capable of. See, that was the whole question, from the beginning. He thought about that January night. See, the stove, the lamp, the 2 cups, the decision made quietly and privately, and without any audience. See, you couldn't have known that's what I was doing, he said. See, I didn't, she said. I found out when you showed up Thursday and kept showing up. See, but that's what I was waiting to see. Whether the man underneath all the protection was someone who could choose. She held his gaze. See, you are. You did. He didn't have an answer to that. See, he let it be what it was. See, they rode the rest of the fence line in the kind of quiet that had taken them months to build. And that was now one of the reliable things in both their lives, present when they needed it, easy to move through, not requiring anything. See, near the south gate, where the pasture fence met the main ranch boundary and the trail back to the house began. Clara reached across the space between their horses and rested her hand over his, where it lay on the saddle horn. See, she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He turned his hand and held hers. See, they rode toward the house in the dying October light, their horses finding the familiar trail without being asked, the ranch closing around them in the comfortable way of a place that has been lived in honestly. See, the barn was still weathered. The east fence would always need something. See, the winters would come again and be what they were, and the road to Redwillow would be 12 miles each way for the rest of their lives. See, but the lamp in the window would be burning when they came in from the dark. See, the table would have 2 chairs and 2 cups. See, the accounts would make sense, and the fence lines would be walked by 2 sets of eyes, and the problems of the land would be handed between 2 minds that had learned to stand at different angles and see the things the other one missed. See, and on the evenings when the day's work was done, and the stove was going, and the cold was outside where it belonged, they would sit at the table that was theirs and talk about the real things, the way they always had directly, specifically, see, with the full attention of 2 people who had each looked at the other's life and found it worth choosing. See, not because it was easy, not because it was perfect. See, because it was honest and real and theirs, and chosen every single day. Chosen, which is the only way a life between 2 people ever actually works, and the only thing worth building toward across all the cold miles of a difficult road. See, the ranch was never too lonely to be loved. Clara was never too wise to want something hard. See, and Gideon Mercer, cautious, stubborn, slow to open, fiercely capable, Gideon Mercer was never destined to remain a man with 1 chair at his table. See, he had simply needed to stop protecting himself from the life that was already waiting for him to let it in. See, he had stopped. He had let it in. And every morning when he came into the kitchen and saw 2 cups on the shelf, he understood something that 12 years of solitary survival had never been able to teach him. That courage is not the absence of fear. See, courage is what happens when you finally decide that what you want is worth more than what you're afraid of. See, the rest of it, all the hard, beautiful, imperfect rest of it, had followed naturally. See, as it does, as it always does, for anyone willing to stop deciding the answer before the question has been asked.